What it feels like to have sex with a narcissist. Most people with narcissistic tendencies do appear to have a strong sexual drive, but psychology makes it clear that the real issue is not how much desire they have, it's how they understand sex itself. In a healthy relationship, sexual intimacy is generally experienced as an expression of love, emotional closeness, and mutual care. It involves presence, empathy, and a genuine desire to give and receive pleasure together. With a narcissist, however, psychologists explain that sex is often filtered through a very different lens: admiration, power, and superiority. This is where many partners begin to feel confused, wounded, and deeply unsettled, because they are approaching intimacy through the language of love, while the narcissist is approaching it through the language of control and ego. Experts such as Dr. Ramani often point out that narcissistic personalities struggle profoundly with emotional empathy, and this deficit shows up very clearly in their sexual behavior. A psychologically healthy person naturally tunes into their partner's comfort, emotional state, and responses during intimacy. There is an instinctive back and forth, a sensitivity to the other person's experience. For a narcissist, sex frequently becomes a way to reinforce dominance and secure what psychologists call narcissistic supply, external validation that confirms their sense of importance, desirability, and power. In this framework, sex is no longer a meeting of two inner worlds. It becomes a stage on which the narcissist's ego is fed. For the partner, the impact can be devastating. Feeling used, unseen, and emotionally unsafe in what should be the most intimate space of the relationship. This sexual selfishness is not accidental, nor is it caused by the partner's shortcomings. Many survivors of narcissistic relationships describe the same pattern. At the beginning, the narcissist appears attentive, generous, even unusually considerate in bed. Psychologists describe this phase as love bombing. During this stage, the narcissist mirrors intimacy and devotion, not because of genuine emotional connection, but because they are securing attachment. Once the partner is emotionally invested, especially after commitment or marriage, the dynamic often shifts. Sexual intimacy becomes increasingly centered on the narcissist's needs alone. When their gratification is met, concern for the partner's emotional or physical experience fades. This leaves the partner feeling confused and deeply guilty, often believing they are the reason intimacy feels empty or painful, when in reality the dysfunction lies in the narcissist's emotional structure. Another pattern that psychologists frequently observe, and that many partners find disturbing, is the narcissist's obsession with being great at sex. In emotionally healthy individuals, the desire to be a good sexual partner is rooted in empathy and care, wanting the other person to feel loved, desired, and fulfilled. A partner's pleasure becomes a shared joy. In contrast, narcissists, particularly somatic narcissists, often pursue sexual performance as a form of self-validation. Their motivation is not their partner's happiness, but proof of their own superiority. They want recognition. They want to feel exceptional, more impressive than previous partners, more powerful, more desirable. For their partner, this creates a painful dynamic in which intimacy feels like a performance review rather than a shared experience. Psychologically, this erodes the partner's sense of worth, because they are valued not for who they are, but for how well they support the narcissist's self-image. There is also another deeply confusing experience many partners face: the gradual withdrawal or outright rejection of sexual intimacy over time. Many relationships with narcissists begin with frequent, intense sexual connection, only for that intimacy to diminish sharply or disappear altogether. Psychology helps explain why this happens. Narcissists are often deeply afraid of emotional intimacy. For a healthy person, emotional closeness does carry vulnerability, but it also brings safety and connection. For a narcissist, vulnerability feels dangerous. Emotional intimacy threatens their sense of control. When sex begins to foster genuine closeness, their internal alarm system activates. One way they protect themselves psychologically is by creating distance through sexual withdrawal. From a clinical perspective, this withdrawal is not about the partner being unattractive, unworthy, or inadequate. It is a defensive maneuver. By reducing or refusing sex, the narcissist maintains emotional distance and preserves their illusion of power. Unfortunately, partners often internalize this rejection, believing it reflects their own failure. Shame, self-blame, and feelings of inadequacy take root. This is where psychological insight becomes essential. Understanding that sexual rejection by a narcissist reflects their fear of intimacy, not the partner's value. Healing begins with correcting the internal narrative. Psychologists consistently emphasize that partners must release misplaced guilt. Sexual problems in narcissistic relationships are not the result of personal inadequacy, but of a power-based dynamic and a profound inability to tolerate emotional closeness. Reclaiming emotional and physical boundaries is critical, recognizing that your body and your needs are not tools for someone else's ego regulation. Therapeutic support and psychoeducation about narcissism can help survivors restore self-worth, rebuild a sense of safety, and relearn what healthy intimacy actually feels like. Ultimately, understanding how narcissists experience sex is not about excusing their behavior, it's about freeing yourself from confusion and self-blame. Healthy intimacy does not leave you feeling empty, ashamed, or invisible. If the most intimate part of your relationship consistently left you emotionally depleted, that is not because you failed as a partner. It is because you were participating in a dynamic that was never designed to nurture mutual connection, but to drain one person in order to sustain another's illusion of power. One of the most common experiences survivors describe, and one that psychologists hear again and again in clinical settings, is the narcissist's absolute inability to tolerate the word no. What makes this especially destabilizing is the double standard involved. A narcissist may refuse intimacy whenever it suits them, without explanation or concern for their partner's emotional needs. But when they want sex, refusal is not permitted. From a psychological perspective, this is not about desire, it is about power. For a narcissistic personality structure, no represents a direct threat to grandiosity. It challenges their internal narrative of superiority, entitlement, and dominance. In their mind, being denied is not neutral. It is an injury. Psychologists explain that narcissists experience boundaries as attacks rather than expressions of autonomy. When a partner says no due to exhaustion, emotional distress, physical pain, or even menstruation, a healthy person can empathize and regulate their disappointment. A narcissist, however, often cannot tolerate this frustration. The refusal triggers what clinicians refer to as narcissistic injury, a sudden collapse of their inflated self-image. To repair that injury, they may resort to coercion, guilt, intimidation, or accusations. Survivors often report being accused of infidelity, disrespect, or emotional coldness simply for asserting bodily autonomy. This dynamic deeply impacts the victim's nervous system, conditioning them to associate self-protection with danger and punishment. Another pattern psychologists frequently identify is the use of sexual access as a tool of control. For a narcissist, sex is not just an intimate act. It becomes a currency. When they sense that their partner is becoming more independent, emotionally distant, or less compliant, they may use sex strategically to reassert dominance. Sometimes this looks like pressure and coercion. Other times, it appears as deliberate withdrawal. Clinicians note that withholding intimacy can function as a form of emotional punishment. By denying sex, the narcissist creates longing, confusion, and self-doubt in their partner, reinforcing dependency. The victim often internalizes this rejection, believing they must try harder or become better to regain closeness, while the narcissist regains a sense of control without ever addressing the underlying relational dysfunction. From a psychological standpoint, this intermittent pattern, giving and withholding intimacy unpredictably, creates what is known as trauma bonding. The nervous system becomes hooked on inconsistency. The partner begins to crave the moments of closeness, even when those moments are brief or hollow, because they offer temporary relief from emotional deprivation. The narcissist benefits from this dynamic because scarcity amplifies desire. By offering intimacy in small, controlled doses, they ensure that their partner remains focused on them, emotionally hungry, and easier to manipulate. Over time, this erodes the victim's sense of agency and reinforces the belief that love must be earned through compliance. Another deeply disturbing pattern many survivors describe is boundary pushing in sexual contexts. Narcissists often derive a sense of satisfaction from persuading or pressuring their partner into sexual acts they are uncomfortable with. Psychologists explain that this behavior is rooted in dominance rather than desire. For a healthy individual, witnessing a partner's discomfort naturally activates empathy and restraint. For a narcissist, however, crossing boundaries can feel like proof of power. When they succeed in making their partner do something against their will, it reinforces their internal fantasy of control and superiority. The emotional cost to the victim is profound. Feelings of violation, shame, and self-betrayal accumulate, often without the language to name what is happening. Over time, many partners describe sexual intimacy with a narcissist as empty, mechanical, or deeply unsettling. Psychology helps explain why. True intimacy requires mutual vulnerability, emotional presence, and empathy, capacities narcissists struggle to access consistently. As a result, sex becomes disconnected from love. Survivors often report feeling unseen, unvalued, and reduced to a means of gratification rather than a whole person. This can create cognitive dissonance. The partner tells themselves they are loved, while their body and emotions register exploitation. That internal conflict frequently leads to anxiety, depression, and profound confusion about one's worth. Healing begins with truth. Psychologists emphasize that recognizing these patterns is not about demonizing the narcissist, but about restoring reality for the victim. Understanding that sexual coercion, withdrawal, and boundary violations are expressions of control, not love, helps release misplaced guilt and shame. Recovery involves reclaiming bodily autonomy, learning to honor internal signals, and rebuilding boundaries that were systematically eroded. Therapeutic support, trauma-informed education, and safe emotional distance are often necessary to help the nervous system recalibrate and relearn what healthy intimacy feels like. If you recognize yourself in these experiences, it is essential to understand this. The emptiness you felt was not a failure of your ability to love. It was the result of being in a dynamic where intimacy was never mutual. You were not desired for who you are, but for what you provided. And realizing that is not weakness, it is clarity. With clarity comes the possibility of healing, self-protection, and eventually, connection that does not cost you your dignity, your safety, or your sense of self. If this message resonated with you, if something in your body tightened, or your mind quietly said, "This explains so much," that's not a coincidence. Psychology tells us that recognition is often the first moment of healing. What you've experienced has a name, a pattern, and most importantly, an explanation. You were not weak. You were conditioned. You were not too sensitive. You were responding normally to prolonged emotional and psychological pressure. If this video helped you put words to what you've lived through, please support this channel by subscribing. This space exists for clarity, education, and truth, grounded in psychological insight, not judgment. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel, you're choosing awareness over confusion. Share this video with someone who might be silently questioning themselves, someone who feels drained, guilty, or unsure without knowing why. Education is powerful, but shared clarity is transformative. And if you feel safe, leave a comment below. You don't need to explain everything. Sometimes simply writing, "This helped me," is enough. Your voice may be the validation someone else desperately needs to hear. This channel is about understanding narcissistic dynamics, emotional consequences, and yes, karma, not as revenge but as psychological truth. When manipulation loses its power, when awareness replaces self-blame, the balance begins to shift. That is real karma. Remember this, clarity is the first form of freedom. And once you see clearly, you can never fully unsee. You are not alone. You were never imagining it. And your healing has already begun. We'll continue this journey together. See you in the next video.